when an army vanished overnight in the Battle of Caporetto. In the cold dawn of October 24, 1917, the mountains of northeastern Italy were shrouded in mist. Between the ridges of the Julian Alps and the river Isonzo, soldiers of the Italian Second Army huddled in trenches they had carved from the limestone slopes. For 2 years they had fought here, 11 battles already, each one a brutal repetition of the last. They had advanced yards, then retreated miles. Their commanders called it strategy. The soldiers called it madness. That morning, something changed. The silence that usually preceded bombardment felt heavier, almost alive. At precisely 2 a.m., the horizon erupted in flashes, greenish-white bursts that seemed unnatural even to veterans of the front. The Austro-Hungarian and German guns had opened fire, but these were no ordinary shells. Mixed among high explosives were gas shells, chlorine, phosgene, and a new, even more insidious chemical, diphosgene. The heavy alpine fog trapped the gas close to the ground, crawling through Italian trenches like a living thing. Men coughed, clawed at their throats, their gas masks soaked and useless in the damp air. Within minutes, entire companies were incapacitated. The bombardment lasted only 4 hours, but it achieved what weeks of artillery could not. It broke the will of an army before the infantry even advanced. When the shelling ceased, the next phase began. German stormtroopers, specially trained infiltration units, moved forward in small groups, carrying light machine guns and grenades. They did not march in lines as older generals preferred. They slipped through gaps, followed ravines, and bypassed strongpoints. It was a new form of warfare, fast, flexible, terrifyingly effective. The Italian defenders, scattered and gas-choked, were overwhelmed before they realized the assault had begun. The village of Caporetto, nestled near the Isonzo, became the focal point. There, the German 12th Army under General Otto von Below and the Austro-Hungarian forces under Svetozar Borojevic smashed into the Italian front. The defenses that had held for years crumbled within hours. General Luigi Capello, commanding the Italian Second Army, had been ill and absent from the front for days. His orders were confused, his communications worse. Units that were supposed to hold their ground found themselves surrounded. Divisions that tried to counterattack discovered that their neighboring regiments had already fled. In the chaos, rumors spread faster than orders. The line was broken. By midday, the German and Austro-Hungarian spearheads had advanced over 5 miles, a staggering distance in the static warfare of the time. They captured bridges, supply dumps, and thousands of prisoners. Italian artillery positions, turned inward on narrow mountain roads, became death traps. Horses bolted, guns were abandoned, and commanders were left with no coherent front to defend. Caporetto was not merely a battle. It was a collapse in real time. As the enemy surged forward, Italian soldiers began to panic. Some threw away their rifles and surrendered. Others fled west toward the Tagliamento River, clogging roads with wagons, livestock, and terrified civilians. What had begun as an organized retreat became a stampede. The German officers, astonished by the scale of their success, pressed forward relentlessly. Their objective was not just to defeat the Italians, but to annihilate their army completely. In the steep valleys, machine gun fire echoed off stone walls, and mountain villages burned as the advancing troops cut through what little resistance remained. This was the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, but unlike the 11 before it, the tide had reversed completely. Italy's proud offensive line had become a rout. At Italian headquarters in Udine, General Luigi Cadorna, the stern, unbending commander-in-chief, refused to believe the reports. He blamed his soldiers, not his strategy. To him, discipline was sacred, disobedience unforgivable. He had executed hundreds of men during the war for cowardice, and now he considered doing the same to entire divisions. But no punishment could halt what was happening in the mountains. As the days passed, the magnitude of the disaster became undeniable. More than 250,000 Italians were captured, 350,000 fled in disarray, and thousands more lay dead or missing in the valleys of the Isonzo. For a nation that had fought so long to hold its fragile front, Caporetto was nothing less than a national trauma. In the villages behind the front, civilians wept as they watched endless columns of defeated soldiers stumble westward. Their uniforms were torn, their faces hollow, their morale destroyed. One Italian officer wrote, "We were like a river with no banks, flowing wherever panic carried us." By the evening of October 24th, the Italian Second Army was no longer a fighting force. It was a mass of confusion spilling down the valleys. Entire corps lost contact with headquarters. Brigades retreated without orders, while others, unaware of the collapse elsewhere, stood their ground until surrounded. The fog, smoke, and shattered communication lines turned the front into a labyrinth of fear. In the chaos, discipline dissolved. Soldiers discarded their rifles, stripped off insignia, and mingled with civilians fleeing west. Supply wagons overturned on mountain roads, blocking the only routes of escape. Horses, wounded and terrified, screamed in the dark as columns tried to push past them. For the first time since Italy had entered the war, the notion of total defeat became real. At Caporetto itself, German and Austro-Hungarian troops poured through the broken line. They captured entire depots filled with food, ammunition, and artillery, enough to supply their armies for weeks. They even found stockpiles of wine and brandy, and soon the narrow streets of the village echoed with the laughter of drunken victors. For the Italians, it was a humiliation beyond description. General Capello, already weakened by fever, struggled to issue coherent orders. He requested reinforcements from Cadorna, but the Supreme Commander's replies were cold and accusatory. Cadorna blamed his subordinates for cowardice and incompetence, insisting that the front be held at all costs. But the front no longer existed. It had evaporated. By October 25th, the enemy had advanced nearly 20 miles. The Italian armies were falling back toward the Tagliamento River, the next natural defensive line. The retreat, however, was more like an exodus. Bridges collapsed under the weight of traffic, and every crossing became a choke point where chaos reigned. Civilians joined the stream. Old men, women, and children carrying what little they could. Towns like Cividale and Udine were overrun before their residents even realized the war had arrived. The Germans exploited every weakness with precision. Using their stormtrooper tactics, they infiltrated rather than assaulted, bypassing resistance to strike deep into the rear. Italian divisions that attempted to regroup found themselves cut off. Messages sent by telegraph went unanswered. The few officers who retained control could only form rearguards to delay the inevitable. Among them was the 3rd Alpine Regiment, who fought desperately in the narrow valleys of Tolmino to cover the retreat. Their courage bought precious hours, but at a terrible cost. Many were surrounded and captured. Others vanished into the mountains. One survivor recalled, "We fought not for victory, but so the others could run farther before the end reached them." As the Italians withdrew, the enemy seized their abandoned guns, over 2,500 pieces of artillery. Entire arsenals, food stores, and hospitals were left behind. German soldiers described advancing through towns where tables were still set with unfinished meals, as if the inhabitants had vanished mid-bite. The swiftness of the collapse stunned even the attackers. By October 27th, the Italian High Command realized Udine could no longer be defended. Headquarters was moved hurriedly to Treviso, and staff officers burned documents to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. When German troops entered the city, they found the Italian commander's dinner still warm on the table. The retreat continued through pouring rain and freezing winds. The mountain roads turned to rivers of mud, and exhausted soldiers slipped and drowned trying to cross streams swollen with autumn rain. Hunger and exhaustion tore through the ranks. Many had not eaten in days. Others simply sat by the roadside and refused to move. In this chaos, Cadorna issued one of the most infamous orders in Italian military history. On October 28th, he demanded that any soldier retreating without orders be shot. Officers were to form firing squads on the spot to restore discipline. Yet even as these commands spread, the reality on the ground made them meaningless. No one could distinguish between retreat, withdrawal, or survival anymore. By the end of October, the enemy reached the Tagliamento River. The Italians attempted to hold the crossings, but bridges collapsed under shell fire and floodwaters. Rearguard units fought gallantly to delay pursuit, but by then, the line was a fiction. The river could not stop what was coming, it only slowed it. When November began, the retreat had stretched over 150 miles. The Italian army, once over 2 million strong, had disintegrated into fragments. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians captured over 250,000 men, seized enormous quantities of weapons, and shattered the myth of Italian strength. In Vienna and Berlin, the victory was celebrated as proof of Central Power superiority. But amid triumph, cracks appeared. German generals warned that their supply lines were stretched and their troops exhausted. The mountainous terrain and worsening weather made further advance difficult. Their goal, to push the Italians completely out of the war, was slipping away in the mud and rain. In Rome, panic spread. Rumors of German troops marching toward Venice caused riots. The government feared the collapse of public order. Prime Minister Paolo Boselli resigned, and a new cabinet was formed under Vittorio Emanuele Orlando. The king himself visited the front to show solidarity, but morale was in tatters. Cadorna, the once unquestioned commander, had lost the confidence of his government and his allies. The British and French, alarmed by the disaster, rushed reinforcements to Italy. Within weeks, divisions from the Western Front began arriving along the Piave River. The French General Ferdinand Foch and British General Henry Wilson arrived to advise and reorganize the defense. Italy's survival now depended on one last stand, anchored not by pride, but by desperation. The soldiers who had fled from Caporetto would have to fight again, this time not for glory, but for the existence of their nation itself. In early November 1917, the exhausted remnants of the Italian army reached the Piave River. It was a cold, swollen barrier cutting across the Veneto plain, running from the Alps to the Adriatic. Behind it lay Venice, Italy's jewel, the city that could not fall. If the Piave line broke, the entire country would be open to invasion. The soldiers knew it. The generals knew it. Even the civilians trudging alongside the columns knew it. The retreating troops were in a pitiful state. Many had walked for days without rest, their boots worn through, their uniforms soaked and caked in mud. Some still clutched rifles without bolts or cartridges. Yet despite everything, there was a flicker of resolve in their faces. They had reached a river, a boundary. Beyond this line, there was nowhere else to run. When General Armando Diaz replaced Cadorna on November 8th, the change in tone was immediate. Diaz was calm where Cadorna had been harsh, pragmatic where his predecessor had been rigid. He abolished the policy of mass executions, reorganized the command structure, and ordered that food and clothing be prioritized for the troops. For the first time in years, soldiers heard a voice that did not threaten them. It reassured them. The new defensive line stretched from Mount Grappa in the north to the lower Piave near Venice. On paper it was formidable, a series of trenches, fortifications, and artillery emplacements covering the natural obstacles of rivers and hills. In reality, it was incomplete and undermanned. Many units arriving from the Isonzo had no heavy weapons left. Some divisions had been reduced to a few hundred men. As November wore on, the enemy approached. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians, buoyed by their victory, pushed across Friuli toward the Piave. Their supply lines, however, were in chaos. Roads were choked with mud, horses starved, and ammunition wagons lagged miles behind the front. The soldiers who had advanced so swiftly from Caporetto now faced the same exhaustion that had broken their opponents. When the first probes reached the river, they were met by something unexpected: determined resistance. Italian artillery, reorganized and resupplied, opened fire with deadly precision. Bridges hastily thrown across the Piave were smashed apart by shells before they could be used. The swollen river itself became an ally, sweeping away pontoons and drowning men who tried to cross under fire. On the slopes of Mount Grappa, the Alpini held their ground with ferocity. These mountain troops, many from the very villages now under occupation, fought with a personal fury. They knew every ridge and ravine, and they used that knowledge to devastating effect. When German stormtroopers tried to outflank them through the mountain passes, they found themselves ambushed at close range. For weeks, the front stabilized. The Italian army, written off as shattered, had found its footing again. Behind the lines, British and French divisions arrived to reinforce the defense. Their presence boosted morale, but it also served another purpose: to assure Italy that it was not alone. The Allies could not afford another front to collapse. Venice itself prepared for siege. Artillery was mounted on the islands, and bridges were rigged with explosives. The city's residents watched nervously as the booming of distant guns echoed across the lagoon. Yet the enemy never came. The German and Austro-Hungarian advance faltered short of the Piave. Their men were too hungry, too cold, and too far from supply bases to continue. By December, it was clear that the offensive had reached its limit. The once unstoppable momentum that began at Caporetto had dissolved in the mud and frost of northern Italy. The Austro-Hungarians dug in on the east bank of the river, their exhausted soldiers staring across at an enemy they had once routed but could no longer dislodge. In Rome, the mood began to shift. The same newspapers that had reported disaster now spoke of endurance and courage. The Piave had become more than a line of defense. It was a symbol of national survival. For the first time, Italians began referring to the battle not as a defeat, but as a turning point. General Diaz used the lull to rebuild. He restored discipline through trust, not fear. Units were restructured, training improved, and morale campaigns launched to remind soldiers what they were fighting for. Posters appeared at the front. Di qui non si passa. They shall not pass from here. The contrast between Caporetto and the Piave was stark. At Caporetto, the army had been a machine collapsing under its own weight. At the Piave, it became a living organism again, wounded but breathing. Diaz understood what Cadorna never had. Men fight better when they believe they're defending something sacred, not just obeying an order. Winter descended harshly that year. Snow buried the high passes, and ice crusted the Piave's surface. The guns fell silent, replaced by the howl of wind through the trenches. Both sides endured, waiting for spring to renew the killing. Yet under that silence, the balance of power had shifted. Italy was no longer the victim of its own chaos. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the other hand, was crumbling from within. Its armies were multinational mosaics, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Hungarians, and Poles, all fighting under a flag few still believed in. Hunger gnawed at the home front, strikes broke out in Vienna, and desertion became rampant. The empire that had struck so powerfully at Caporetto was beginning to die by 1,000 internal cuts. For Italy, survival was no longer enough. There was a growing desire to erase the shame of Caporetto with redemption on the same soil. Every soldier who crossed the Piave on sentry duty could see the ruined villages of Friuli shimmering in the distance. Somewhere out there lay the fields where their comrades had fallen, where their country had nearly been lost. The thought festered and hardened into resolve. The time would come to cross back over that river, not in retreat, but in pursuit. By the spring of 1918, the world's attention had shifted to the Western Front, where German forces launched their desperate spring offensive. But on the Italian front, a quieter transformation was underway. The once shattered Italian army was now reorganized, rearmed, and slowly regaining confidence under General Diaz's patient leadership. Across the Piave River, the Austro-Hungarian army stood watch, hungry, cold, and increasingly uncertain whom it was still fighting for. Inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, unity had begun to unravel. Each nationality, Czechs, Croats, Slovaks, Poles, Hungarians, demanded self-determination. Soldiers no longer saw the Habsburg crown as something worth dying for. In the trenches, desertion was becoming epidemic. Letters from home spoke of food riots, collapsing economies, and the slow suffocation of an empire that had survived for centuries on borrowed loyalty. The men on the Italian front could sense the decay. Orders from Vienna came slower, supplies arrived half-empty, and morale sank deeper with every passing week. Officers tried to rally their troops by reminding them of Caporetto's glory, but the victory felt distant, like a dream that had lost its color. For Italy, this disintegration was both a reprieve and an opportunity. The new front along the Piave gave time for industry to recover. Factories in Milan and Turin churned out artillery, machine guns, and aircraft. Food and ammunition arrived more steadily, and morale among the civilian population began to recover. Propaganda posters showed the Piave as a guardian spirit, its waters washing away dishonor, its flow marking a line between defeat and rebirth. Allied support was crucial. French and British forces stationed along the Piave line provided not only reinforcements, but modern equipment and tactical expertise. Air superiority began to shift toward the Italians as squadrons like the famed 91st, home to ace Francesco Baracca, took to the skies. His white horse emblem became a symbol of Italian resurgence. Years later, Enzo Ferrari would adopt it as his company's logo. Meanwhile, in the enemy ranks, the strain was visible even to their commanders. General Borojevic, one of Austria-Hungary's most capable leaders, warned Vienna that his army could not endure another winter without fresh supplies. His appeals went unanswered. The empire was too busy collapsing inward, its own nationalities now more interested in independence than victory. The situation reached a breaking point in June 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian High Command, desperate for a decisive blow, launched one last offensive along the Piave. It was to be the empire's final gamble, a mirror image of Germany's simultaneous offensives in France. Borojevic's troops crossed the river under heavy artillery cover, managing to establish small bridgeheads on the western bank. But their initial success quickly turned to disaster. Italian artillery, now better coordinated and more mobile, unleashed a barrage that turned the riverbanks into slaughterhouses. The swollen Piave rose violently due to heavy rains, sweeping away pontoon bridges and drowning entire battalions. Machine guns mowed down men trapped on sandbars. Communications collapsed as officers fell and units became isolated. Within days, what had begun as a bold offensive degenerated into chaos. By June 23rd, the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian forces were retreating in disorder, abandoning their dead and equipment to the river. The Battle of the Piave, as it became known, ended in complete failure for the Central Powers. Over 150,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The river that had once marked Italy's last hope had now become the graveyard of an empire's ambitions. After that defeat, Vienna's war machine effectively ceased to function. Its allies noticed. In Berlin, German officers grimly noted that Austria-Hungary could no longer be relied upon to hold the southern front. The German army, already overstretched in France, could send no reinforcements. The once proud alliance that had shattered Italy at Caporetto was disintegrating. Inside the Italian ranks, the change was electric. Soldiers who had once doubted their commanders now stood taller. Rumors spread that the Austrians were ready to collapse entirely. The same villages where panic had ruled in 1917 were now buzzing with quiet confidence. Trenches once dug in despair were fortified with purpose. Italy had gone from a nation on the brink of collapse to one preparing for redemption. By late summer, reconnaissance flights confirmed what many suspected. The enemy's positions were weakening. Trenches were undermanned, artillery fire sporadic, and supply convoys almost non-existent. The Italian command began planning its counter-offensive, a coordinated strike to finally break the Austro-Hungarian front and end the war on the Italian soil where it had begun. General Diaz called it a final test of endurance, but everyone knew what it truly was, a reckoning for Caporetto. Every division, every battalion, carried that name like a scar. The officers who had survived the rout now saw a chance to wash it away with victory. The soldiers who had fled across the Piave a year earlier would now cross it again, but in the opposite direction. As autumn approached, Italy prepared for the offensive that would decide not just the war, but the survival of the nation itself. Behind the front lines, priests blessed regiments, and factories rang day and night with the hammering of shells. The tricolor flag was raised over every town, fluttering against gray skies. The empire on the other side of the river was already dying. It just did not know it yet. By October 1918, the Piave River had become more than a defensive line. It was the frontier between a nation reborn and an empire in its death throes. In the valleys and plains beyond, the Austro-Hungarian army, once a formidable multinational machine, was dissolving into fragments. Food was scarce, soldiers mutinied, and rumors of revolution in Vienna rippled through the ranks. The Italian command sensed that the moment had come. General Diaz waited patiently until the signs of decay were unmistakable. On October 24th, exactly 1 year after the disaster at Caporetto, he gave the order to attack. It was not coincidence. The date was chosen deliberately, a symbolic reversal of fate. At dawn, Italian artillery thundered across the Piave, shaking the earth for miles. The barrage rolled forward like a storm, tearing through enemy trenches and shattering the remnants of Austrian morale. Then the infantry moved. Across the mist-covered riverbanks, Thousands of men surged forward on pontoons and rafts. Engineers worked frantically to rebuild bridges under fire, while machine gun teams laid suppressing bursts across the opposite bank. The Piave, which had once swallowed Italian soldiers in retreat, now carried them toward redemption. The main thrust came near Vittorio Veneto, a small town nestled at the foothills of the Alps. Here the Italian 8th and 10th armies, supported by British and French divisions, struck with overwhelming force. The Austro-Hungarian front wavered and then crumbled. Units composed of Czechs and Slovaks refused to fight. Hungarian troops mutinied. Officers abandoned their posts, realizing the empire they served no longer existed in spirit. By October 27th, Italian cavalry poured through the gap. Columns of infantry followed, their pace quickened by a mix of fury and disbelief. Villages that had been occupied for a year greeted them with tears and embraces. Church bells rang out across liberated valleys, echoing over fields still littered with the debris of retreating armies. For the Austro-Hungarians, the retreat turned catastrophic. The roads toward Udine and Trento became rivers of men, tens of thousands trying to flee while Italian artillery pounded from behind. Bridges collapsed under the weight of wagons and guns. Horses died in the mud, and soldiers threw down their weapons just to keep walking. Prisoners came in by the thousands, many too exhausted even to raise their hands in surrender. Within a week, the Italian army advanced nearly 25 miles, capturing over 300,000 enemy troops and hundreds of artillery pieces. It was not just a tactical victory. It was the final collapse of an empire. In Vienna, Emperor Karl's government was disintegrating. On October 28th, Czechoslovakia declared independence. The next day, Croatia and Slovenia broke away. Hungary followed immediately after. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy, spanning centuries and countless nations, was dissolving faster than anyone could comprehend. The front in Italy was only its visible symptom. The empire was dying from within. By the end of October, its army was no longer fighting for victory, but for survival. And on October 29th, Italian troops crossed the Tagliamento River, the same river they had fled across in terror after Caporetto. Now they advanced with quiet determination, their boots crunching over the ruins of bridges once packed with desperate men. Each mile forward erased a little more of the shame that had haunted them for a year. In the mountain passes, the Alpini fought the last stubborn Austrian units still resisting. Fierce snowstorms swept the peaks, but even the weather could not stop the momentum. On October 31st, they captured Trento. That same day in Vienna, Emperor Karl issued his last desperate appeal for a ceasefire. It came too late. The Italian command continued pressing until November 3rd. By then, the enemy was broken beyond repair. At Villa Giusti, near Padua, representatives of Austria-Hungary arrived to sign the armistice. General Pietro Badoglio, speaking for Italy, received them coldly, but without triumphal cruelty. The terms were harsh: immediate cessation of hostilities, surrender of artillery, and withdrawal from all occupied territories. At 3 p.m. on November 4, 1918, the guns on the Italian front fell silent. After more than 3 years of carnage, the war in Italy was over. Soldiers stood motionless in the drizzle, unsure whether to cheer or weep. Some crossed themselves. Others simply sat down in the mud and stared into the grey distance, too tired to feel anything at all. The victory at Vittorio Veneto was more than a military success. It was the redemption of a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. Italy had lost 650,000 men in the war, but it had survived, something many had doubted possible after Caporetto. In the following days, newspapers declared the battle La Vittoria, the victory that had avenged all defeats. When the news reached the villages of the Piave Valley, bells tolled again, not for mourning this time, but for deliverance. Refugees began returning to the ruins of their homes, crossing bridges rebuilt from the wreckage of war. The fields that had once swallowed armies slowly filled with silence. For the survivors, the triumph was bittersweet. The memories of Caporetto would never truly fade. The rivers and ridges of northern Italy were soaked in too much blood for victory to erase the pain. But as the soldiers marched home, battered flags in hand, they carried something the army had lost long ago: pride. And so, 1 year after the nightmare that had begun in the mist above Caporetto, Italy's soldiers returned as victors. The river that had witnessed their humiliation had now witnessed their salvation. When the echoes of the guns finally faded along the Piave, Italy stood at a strange crossroads, victorious, yet haunted. The country had survived the storm, but at a price so steep it left scars across generations. Entire towns were gone. Fields once green were pocked with craters and littered with bones. The men who returned from the front did so older than their years, carrying invisible wounds no parade could heal. In Rome, politicians celebrated La Vittoria as proof of destiny fulfilled. They spoke of empire and renewal, of Italy rising among the great powers. But in the trenches, where the smell of gas and death still lingered, the soldiers were less triumphant. They had seen too much. Caporetto was not forgotten. It lingered as a warning, whispered by those who had lived through its terror. It reminded them how quickly arrogance could turn to ruin. The name Caporetto became more than a place. It became a word for disaster itself, a national metaphor for collapse, born of pride and blindness. Even decades later, Italians would use it to describe any great failure. Yet without that catastrophe, the rebirth at Vittorio Veneto might never have come. Out of humiliation had risen endurance, out of despair, resolve. General Diaz, calm and reserved, understood this better than anyone. When asked to describe the victory, he said little. His only message to the nation was brief. The enemy, broken and defeated, has ceased fighting. No boast, no glory, only finality. It was an ending shaped by exhaustion, not exultation. Across the Alps, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist. Its people woke up to new flags, new borders, and new nations born from its ruins. The world had shifted irreversibly, and Caporetto, though fought in a narrow valley, had played its part in unraveling an empire that once seemed eternal. For Italy, the war had forged unity through suffering. Cities that had never cared for the mountains now wept for their lost sons. Peasants and poets, factory workers and officers, all had bled in the same mud. In that sense, the defeat at Caporetto and the victory at Vittorio Veneto were two halves of the same lesson, that a nation is not defined by triumph alone, but by the endurance to rise after falling. In the quiet years that followed, the river Piave became sacred ground. Veterans returned to stand by its banks, listening to the current that had once carried their fear, then their hope. They said the river spoke softly to those who listened long enough. It whispered of men who had vanished overnight, and of a country that refused to. And as the waters flowed on toward the sea, they carried both names with them, Caporetto, the wound, and Vittorio Veneto, the healing.